Welcome, welcome. So glad that you can join us. Not certain what time it is where you are, or even what day it is. It may be Wednesday where you are, it may be Tuesday. But I am super excited to moderate this panel about ethical considerations for AI and learning analytics. I'm joined with Dr. Stephanie Blackmon and Dr. Dirk Ifenthaler. Unfortunately, Dr. Stephanie Moore was not able to join us for this session due to a scheduling conflict. So a couple of housekeeping items. We are in a webinar mode, so unfortunately, what that means is that you see us the whole time. But what you can do is if you raise your hand and you want to open your mic, then I can allow you permission to speak to ask your question, or you can add it into the chat. As Dr. Blackmon and Dr. Ifenthaler are going through, if you have any questions, please add them to the chat. And as the moderator, I will try to work those into that. So our agenda and what we're hoping to accomplish is we have some brief overviews from each of the panelists. That's going to be about 5 to 10 minutes where they sort of talk and sort of give their research agenda and how it relates to ethical considerations. And then we're going to use the balance of the time for a question and answer. So we have a couple of questions that we've already had asked, but please feel free to add more questions. We're looking for this to be more of a discussion, a conversation, as opposed to a sage on the stage type of presentation. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Blackmon.
Hi, everybody. Great to see so many of you here today. So as Dr. Moore shared, we'll start off with general descriptions about the kind of work we do. And then for me anyway, I'll talk about some of the pressing issues related to AI and ethics that are related to the work that I'm doing currently. So I am a professor in the School of Education at the School of Education at William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And my research specifically focuses on tech integration in teaching and learning in higher education. So more specifically, what I look at are issues related to qualitative experiences that people have with trust and privacy and technology integration. So the learning experience, broadly speaking, because I've done a lot of work with massive open online courses and still do quite a bit of work with that as well, but also thinking about other types of technology. So I look at wearable devices, at learning management systems, learning analytics, a lot of other tech integration as well, but always in thinking about what that's doing in terms of teaching, what that's doing in terms of learning, and now more recently, what that means in terms of trust, privacy, security, those kinds of issues. I'm also an affiliate faculty member. Here in Virginia, we have something called the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative, and I'm an affiliate faculty member with that as well, and do work there related to experiential learning and technology integration. And so some of the issues then that I think about related to AI adoption in college and university teaching and learning are really thinking about not just the macro level, but the micro level as well. Recently, colleagues and I'm a co-PI on a grant that was recently funded. We'll start work on this in September. That's actually thinking about human AI interaction in workforce development. So a little bit with the professional development and professional learning space as well, but always thinking with teaching and learning about how we can have much more ethical use of the technologies that we integrate. And so I talk about the micro levels. And when I say micro level, what I'm talking about are just these everyday occurrences that we have with tech integration. So in a conversation recently, for example, I suggested, hey, why don't we think more about what's happening with the security components, the technology components, the trust components, privacy, et cetera. And so one of the people in the conversation said, well, we've got a person in the tech office who actually handles that. So wonderful to have that macro level, but sometimes there is confusion between what's necessary at the macro level, which those privacy positions really are incredibly important, but also at the micro level. So what's happening when people are actually using these technologies in classrooms? So what does it mean for an advisor, for example, to ethically incorporate AI data? What does it mean for students to understand that these AI components are even happening in their courses? What does it mean for faculty? What does it mean for how faculty teach? What does it mean for faculty evaluation? So some of those micro level conversations that are kind of slipping through the cracks, even though some universities are doing a really great job of having positions at the macro level in terms of who they have contracts with, what they agree to in those contracts. Those components, again, are very important, but there are other conversations that are absolutely integral to the ethical use of AI at that micro level as well. The other complicating factor that I think about in my work is data as a commodity. So what does it mean now that data is a commodity when we're starting to incorporate AI in higher education? So data has a value for organizations outside of the college or university. And do we really understand what that means? Are students aware of that? Are faculty members aware of that? Are other administrators who are using this data or who are suggesting these various ways of incorporating AI, are we all thinking about the ethics of data as a commodity and what that means when we're incorporating these various tools into higher education? And so there's a list of reference there that can be really helpful for talking about some of those components of it. And then there's several others as well, but that just happened to be the one that I landed on at the moment. Next slide, please. One of the things I also think about is that the privacy implications can be different across groups. So those kinds of nuances are absolutely integral to AI ethics conversations as well. For example, colleagues and I, about a year ago, so we presented this at AERA, but we started the grant around 2020. And we had funded research. I was the lead PI on a project that explored trust, privacy, and tech integration in the disability community. And we partnered with an organization in the disability community and had some really, really wonderful participants to give us to share more about their experiences related to technology integration. And so what we found in that research is that not only are there differences related to the experiences that people have with technology across people in the disability community and people who are not, but within disability communities with intersectional identities, that there are nuances coming up that people are not readily considering. For example, participants who are in the disability community, but also LGBTQIA+, who are people of color and also in the disability community, that there were differences across their experiences with technology integration as a result of their multiple identities in whatever community they identified with. And those kinds of conversations, again, aren't coming up as much. So when we think about the ethics of AI implication, those components are very, very impactful and can make a huge difference in how people are experiencing the technology in higher education. And in fact, can create harm in places for some people that it's not creating for other people. So a huge ethical component there related to those nuances. And it's something that, again, should be added to the nuance of conversations around ethics and AI. There's also the matter of the narrative that AI can construct, the data from AI can construct, and really understanding how that has an impact on student agency. That if there are no counter narratives, if there are no voices that speak back to these narratives that are created about students, then it can have implications not only for their morale and how they see themselves, but also for their futures at universities, for their futures and careers, or for their future aspirations. So again, thinking about the narrative is also a part of thinking about the ethical application of AI in higher education. Next slide, please. And so some of the things that can happen, right, are thinking about, along with the incorporation of AI, opportunities to, again, speak back to the narratives that are generated about students learning through AI, that are the narratives that are communicated about teaching through AI, because we also start to see an increase in how people are using AI as a part of faculty evaluation and looking at the data that's generated to say how someone is performing, not only as a student, but how someone is performing as a faculty member. Colleges and universities being more transparent about data collection, data sharing, data privacy, and the implications of AI use in teaching and learning. So again, back to that larger point of, we've got the macro level conversations that are happening, but there's a need for the micro level conversations as well. And then colleges and universities really just need more direct discussion about what can and cannot be done with the data generated through AI for teaching and learning. So I will stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stephanie. That was really a great start for me to jump on. And I especially like these micro and macro perspective, and maybe also there's the meso perspective in between, which we can relate to. And everybody is kind of involved in these processes. And from my perspective today, I just want to point out a little bit the student perspective, because that's also kind of the theme, of course, of the whole event. So I digged out some research being published recently in this space. But before I'm going to start on the student perspective, I want to mention that the European Union is currently working on this AI Act, and also reflecting within this AI Act for the European Union. So it's something adding to the European Data Protection Regulation, focusing on AI applications. And there's one section which is also focusing on learning analytics and AI in education. And the interesting thing is that they have a classification of AI being established. And so there's high-risk systems and low-risk systems. And depending on how these systems are functioning and what impact they have, for example, on the students, they will be high-risk systems. And that means that these systems are not allowed in our education system. And that causes, of course, kind of worries and issues on the one side, but on the other side, of course, it also protects from third-party vendors coming into the education field and trying to, to harvest all the data and then, of course, building harm around our students and even also our educators or the whole institutions. So that's an interesting conversation going on the EU level, and I'm curious how this will end up in currently. They are talking about learning analytics system, for example, if they're not involved in any exam things happening, for example, that would be a low risk system. But as soon as AI also has some implications for grading students, that might be high risk. And so what is not part of our learning environment, which creates some implications for the performance of the students? That's the question. So you can go really deep into these aspects and try to understand, is this still a low risk or high risk system? And that's ethical issues coming up here. And so what's ethics in that space? It's norms and values our society is creating, of course, and these norms and values are part of our conversation and also part of this conversation within this in this forum or in this panel. And it adds, of course, a context to the norms and values we have in all our institutions. So there might be, of course, differences within the different levels you mentioned, Stephanie, and the micro perspective and the meso and the macro perspective, based on the values and norms existing. And that, of course, is this communication process our society is going through. And as new things are coming in, like AI, we are building our norms and values step by step in understanding, and of course also through providing research findings. And so this is what I brought today, is some insights from studies. And here's an interesting study. It's a review on contributions in the field, focusing on different stakeholders and related ethical issues, and also the possible harm which can be caused from AI and learning analytics. And if you look in here in this part of the table, they present the studies which are related to the learners, to the students, and here we have some interesting aspects, like the performance-related stress for learners, which has been found in some studies. And I think that's an interesting ethical concern we have to address. So whenever we use AI, that might cause, on the student perspective, stress or even psychological and physical well-being issues. And we have to understand how this AI system could really influence this in a negative way, so building harm. But on the other side also, how could we use this system to overcome these possible risks? And that's exactly the conversation we have to drive, and which in my understanding of the field has not gone as deep enough as we should go. And so whenever any learning analytics system, AI system for education is being implemented, this perspective is very much important. And the other example here, the spoon-feeding learning approach, and these risks of demotivation, so not having self-regulated learners anymore, so letting them just be on track on and the systems is basically telling what they have to do in order to perform in the mid-range of expectations and well, demonstrating the competence they should. Is this the right approach a university or higher education institution should really go? Is this our ethical understanding, our norm of the new education system? Or should we go in a different way and say, okay, no, we want to build our self-regulated learners. We want to have critical thinking in the foreground. And that's, not needing, in the first sense, AI systems. Also, identifying students at risk as the prime example in MOOCs, you mentioned, Stephanie. So what is this perspective? So do we have to identify our students at risk and then send them emails or inform them that they are at risk? Or is it our social norm or value that we also want to let them fail? So is failure something they should also, from an ethical perspective, they should experience? And from that perspective, they can learn. Or should we really take all at-risk students and spoon feed them towards not being at risk anymore? So these are questions, of course, coming up, and these are deeply rooted ethical questions. And there's ethical concerns about these questions, but also there's need for building further action. So can we go to the next? So this is a study which has been done by some colleagues at Curtin University. And I'm also affiliated with Curtin University in Australia. So I'm there a UNESCO Deputy Chair on Data Science and Higher Education Learning and Teaching. And this study has been a qualitative study looking into students' perceptions towards learning analytics and the use of data, and really deepening this understanding from students' perspective again. So I thought these quotes are quite interesting. The first one, the student said, I signed the document 4 years ago. So this student was kind of course, advanced in their studies already. And now they completely forgot what's the consent form you already included about data use and privacy aspects. So the question really is, how can we take action here from an ethics perspective to keep up the knowledge about these documents and keep up the information of our students, that they need to understand what data is used in what type of system, and can they always turn off the system? So that's of course also from a European perspective. The European Data Protection Regulation says I have to opt into a system before the system is even tracking any data of myself. And that can be done by signing when you enroll into a university, and that's this document, this consent form, and then it's good for the whole study program. Is this the right way to do it? We do it in a different way. At the University of Mannheim, I have included a learning analytics system where for each individual unit of study, the students have to opt in. So they get reminded over and over again about issues being part of this AI system, and of course the data being collected around them. So that's important aspects. And again, we have to go into the depth of these assumptions to support our students and help our students to overcome this. The other thing is here, the second quote, also an interesting one. So if somebody gets an email that would influence the overall grade, did all the other students also get this email? So the ethics perspective here of this student is clear, of course. If somebody gets help, I should also get help, right? So even if I'm not at risk, I should also be supported. In that sense, maybe I come from a B grade to an A grade, or even to a higher distinction grade. So that's the ethics concern also in that perspective. So if we provide help through AI, is it for everybody? And what about those students who are not opting in? So they're losing out in the end question. All these questions about ethics have to be raised by all the stakeholders, but also for each individual institution in order to create these values and norms. Can we go to the next?
Actually, before we go, I just received a question I think is tied into what you've been talking about. So the question, and I'll add it to the chat here so everyone can see. So the question is, how do we bring student voice into the ethical considerations for AI and learning analytics on student data that institutions have collected, and how institutions use the student data? So ask that question for both panelists, if either one wants to answer, or both.
Yeah, very much. So for us, it's a designing a value-oriented approach. So really having the students participatory approaches of students and of course lecturers and teaching staff included in all the phases where we implementing learning analytics and AI in our higher education institutions. So that's the standard, I would say, we have to set for our institutions. So whenever an institution decides to go this route, they have to build these value-oriented design approaches and say, okay, we include all the stakeholders, we have the student voices when we start, implementing a data warehouse, when we start implementing a support system, when we start to use data. So that's the value-oriented design approach. And of course, then there might be focus groups and other opportunities, open forums where students can pose questions, but also majority voting, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of opportunities if you provide this value-oriented approach. So not a top-down decision, we are doing AI now. So that's of course not functioning and working. So that would be my perspective, and that's how we did it basically throughout my work over the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, and I agree with Dirk's point that if you're starting from a place of inclusion, then that's how you're hearing from the multiple stakeholders and how you're getting perspectives that you may not have thought of as just a smaller committee sitting around the table or around the Zoom. I also think, though, that there are some people who are in the throes of that right now, right? They are already, that train has left the station and they are incorporating all of these different tools. I don't think that it's too late to start to correct some of those practices. So having that values-oriented approach, taking that approach when you're adopting new technology, but also for the technology you've already adopted, for the AI that you are already using, communicating with people that that's actually there. Sometimes students and faculty are not aware of some of the tools that are being used to evaluate their work, to evaluate their performances, for students to evaluate their learning. And so communicating those upfront, just because a place has adopted a technology and is already using it does not mean that they can't pause and say, hey, here's what we have done. Here is an opportunity for you to provide feedback to us. What concerns do you have about this? What things maybe did we not consider when we first did this? There is always an opportunity to pause and focus on that inclusion and get students' perspectives and the perspectives of other stakeholders as well.
And we had another question, I just added it to the chat. What are the aspects that should be considered for protection of personal data in a learning profile of K-12 students?
So that the part with K-12 sometimes gets tricky because there's an assumption that there is more protection around that data. And in some cases, there is quite a lot more, because you're not just going through the student at that point, obviously, because most of the time they're not of the age of consent in K-12. So you have to have a parent or guardian to also give permission to access data, or who's going to have knowledge of data. So in the US, right, with something like FERPA, where parents are supposed to be notified about what's happening with their kids' data, or guardians are supposed to be notified about what's happening with children's data. But I think a similar approach to the one we just talked about for higher education can also be used in K-12, that when people implement systems, it's often with this excitement about what it's going to provide. Oh, we're going to be able to connect so much better. Look, you'll be able to see all of this information, and you can chat with me on this particular device, without sometimes thinking about the implications of that. And so in the same way that in higher education, we're saying, hey, have this approach where you're including people from the start, where you're thinking about people from the start. And if you've already started, pause and start to gather that information. The same thing can happen in K-12 spaces as well, because you don't want to miss out on these. If something is a great opportunity that can help families feel more included, or people who are providing care for kids more included and helping the kids feel more included, then that's wonderful. But it's not so wonderful when there's a data breach. So thinking about that, including people and making these processes and the technologies very clear upfront, and talking about the implications for those upfront, can be helpful in a K-12 space as well, I think.
Yeah, I can also relate to this, and it's not only true for K-12, it's also for the higher education or for workplace learning context. It's a great opportunity if you get started with thinking about including data in these institutions. It's the great opportunity to go back and look what our values and norms of us, our institution, our community of learning. And so going back and saying, okay, our value is, for example, supporting each student in order to become a critical thinker. So if that would be the one of the values of the school, of the K-12 school, then the question could be posed, and if everybody agrees on that, so that's our value we are sharing, that's a first step, and that's a great opportunity that you have a conversation about this aspect. And then if everybody agrees on these aspects, what are our values and norms for our education system, then you could look into what are system characteristics or features of AI systems which link to our values and norms we have been discussing. And if there's no features existing, of course, then you would not use any of those because they are not in compliance with your values and norms. But if you find some features which are linked to that, then I think everybody would be happy to use it and of course embrace the opportunities coming from these features. So that's the way to go, and not the other route, saying, okay, this is our system. Now let's see if we can somewhat fit it to our understanding of our values and norms. So that's I think the most important thing. And data protection, of course, what the guardians and our parents have to provide in K-12 is very different to other education systems, of course. And I would expect that that the school leadership is kind of proposing data protection regulations and make everything clear and transparent. So that's following the ART principles. So accountability. So knowing the regulations and laws as a school leadership and providing that, of course, towards the stakeholders, then building responsibility for data and saying clear, we as school leaders, we are responsible for data and for access to data. And then the T of the ART principle is the transparency. So building transparency. Who has access to data, for example, for what type of analysis data is used, et cetera, et cetera. So following these ARC principles, I think, is a good way in order to get started in K-12 as well.
So there's a great question about collaborative learning, but actually there's a follow-up question to something that you had talked about, Dirk, with this consent form. And the question is, do students typically have sufficient knowledge of the benefits and risks due to the collection and use of their data to approach a consent request with criticality?
Yeah, that's exactly the problem, right? So we have to create a education data literacy as a competence throughout all our stakeholders. We had a EU funded project running over the last 3 or 4 years. And this is where we created a education data literacy competence framework, which is a great opportunity to get started and build your own competence, not only as a student, but also as a teacher and other administrators. And based on this competence, on this new competence everybody has to, of course, acquire, then an informed decision can be made based on these concerns. But without education data literacy, an informed decision on these consent forms is impossible, or even scattered, right? So that would be a short question here. And the framework, the competence framework is about using data, understanding about data, comprehensive understanding about the data use and analysis, but also about privacy and ethics. So that's also included in the framework. You can check it out in, I put it in the chat. It's Learn to Analyze. That's all free and open on the website.
Dr. Blackmon, did you have anything you wanted to add to this question about students not understanding the benefits and risks of the consent?
Just a bit, because I know that Dirk has a bit more he wants to get to and relate to his presentation, but to his point about a skill for digital literacy, that is a critical component, right? For students to lead, particularly higher education, with an understanding of how to make sense of some of these really challenging documents related to their privacy, until we move to a place where plain language is used more frequently. Then there is going to be, and even then, right, when people move to plain language, there still has to be a space for these conversations about what this means, because it impacts students in higher education, but it impacts them beyond higher education as well. So what I've suggested in publications and presentations, et cetera, where I've talked about this before, is just like you have, at least in the US, there's something called, you have a freshman orientation or an orientation for students who have transferred to the university, just like you're talking about all of these other important components of being on the campus, of being a great student while they're there. That's a great place to talk to them about digital literacy. It is a great place to start talking with them about what's happening with their data and helping them to make sense of what's happening with their data so that they can make informed decisions when they're signing documents, and also moving to plain language, asking for that, pushing for that. And when negotiating about what these systems are and what these systems are doing, because then that lowers or removes, in some cases, a huge barrier, which is the legalese that the students have to get through to understand what some of these devices are doing.
Yeah, fantastic. So let's move on. So I think we can skip this one because we already talked about the student perspective quite well, but let's go to the next one. And we've been touching the privacy concern quite a lot already. So privacy is really a multidimensional concept, which we consider to be a very important personal development. And so it's about the self-development. So you build your privacy concern around what would you experience as yourself within different situations, and especially also, of course, in the education field. But also there's some environmental impact building towards your privacy concerns. So, for example, if the institution has been always transparent and communicating about decisions and processes, that has, of course, a positive impact toward your privacy concern. But if you're coming into a new institution and there might be no information, and you know, there might be just a consent form you have to fill out and sign, and that's it basically. So that might be, of course, a negative environmental impact and creating a privacy concern. And then, of course, there's interpersonal interactions with others, you know, so you start interacting with the teachers and you start interacting with the students, and that builds, of course, also a part of your privacy concern. So that in mind, again, relates to the art principles and how institutions and, of course, individual stakeholders within the institution need to communicate about privacy, use of data, and that, of course, builds the ethical umbrella for feeling safe or for feeling harm in these situations. Can we go to the next? So we created this privacy calculus a few years ago, and that's also, I can point to this education, technology, research and development special issue here. It's about ethics and design. And so we published, so that's 2016 published. And so we proposed this privacy calculus here, which identifies a decision matrix when you are open for sharing data and being also open for using AI systems in education. And there's clearly a concern over privacy which comes from this multidimensional construct. But then there is minimizing and maximizing factors influencing your decision making. So meaning that a maximizing factor for concern over privacy would be there's no information at all about the AI system. They are just implemented and they're used, and you don't get any benefits out of it because only the school leadership is kind of, you know, seeing the data and has access to the data. So that's a big maximizing concern over privacy. On the other side, a minimizing factor towards concern over privacy would be it's transparent. You have access and you can control all the access to data. You can decide who has access to your own data you're producing, etc., etc. So that might be things which minimize the concern over privacy, and of course then create your decision towards sharing your data or not. So that's, I think, the key of thinking around ethics concerns when data is being involved. And in this study I'm referencing here, we have been creating evidence that it significantly relates this concern over privacy towards the use and the sharing of data. Can we go to the next, because time is running out, I see. So in general, I want to point out that there's some social responsibility we have to discuss within this conversation about ethics and AI. And the idea is, of course, in social responsibility, everybody helps everybody to make our society a greater place. So that's basically the idea. So, and if now AI is coming in and data analytics, how does this social responsibility norm change? That's the question. So we have another stakeholder, another entity coming into this. So is AI regarded as somebody else helping us, or is AI regarded as the bad thing, the black box, harming this social responsibility norm and creating chaos in this social responsibility? So that's something we could deepen up in our conversation later on. But let's move to the last slide to give you some last idea. So there has been a latest publication focusing on the idea that every education institution should have an ethics officer. And this ethics officer has key requirements to be solved. And so from one perspective, I think this digital ethics officer is great, because it's an instance within the institution helping to share and communicate about ethics in the institution and the use of data and AI. But on the other side, this sole person as a person ethics officer is not enough. As we discussed before, everybody should be part of the conversation about ethics and privacy concerns, and not only one person in the institution. So here a good advantage having the ethics officer, but not forgetting that everybody as a stakeholder should be included in the conversation about ethics. So I think I have to stop here. I could talk for hours, but there's some notes Bob will read aloud, right? So up to you, please.
So unfortunately, Dr. Stephanie Moore is not able to join us, so I have some notes to share. So Dr. Stephanie Moore is an assistant professor of technology at the University of New Mexico, and she teaches on ethics and educational technology. She's also a fellow with the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy, working on the use of learning technologies for adult literacy, including investigating AI solutions, tech for good. One of the things that is super exciting is that she is currently working on, and should be out in early 2023, the first textbook that looks at ethics and educational tech. So she's really studied ethical issues in the ed tech ID world for over 20 years, and it's encapsulated in those experiences are reflected in that book. So that's something to look forward to. One of the things that she wants to communicate and share is that we should look at ethics as design. And that's not a simple dichotomy as just simple yes, no, adopt or reject. There's a bit more nuance within that, right? And we need to look at those ethical problems like design problems and look at ways of devising solutions and use design to inform that. Additionally, she's done quite a bit of work on accessibility, specifically not just applying an accessibility checklist, because she didn't have those when she first started working. Instead, what she's doing is working with students to better understand their needs and then developing and testing those different solutions. So an example is embedded messages designed to better support site navigation and decrease cognitive load. So finally, ethics in AI is not simply about not doing or using something, but rather identifying those ethical issues that design parameters or constraints. So we have several questions, and there was one question that was asked by an audience attendee I want to go back to. And the question for the panelists is, what do you think about ethical issues in collaborative learning?
I can make it quick in terms of the a practical example from my teaching and at university. There are big concerns from students, for example, if they have to build working groups and create some content which might be also part of their performance assessment. And there's lots of ethical concerns being related to this. And so is this a social responsibility to help everybody in the group, to grow as a group and perform well? Or is it something else happening in these groups? And sometimes really you have to be the moderator from an ethical point of view to really make the students understand what is their task and why are they working as a group. So growing as a person in a collaborative environment rather than being self-focused. So that's something which needs to take place in. And then another layer to this is of course when we use AI systems to predict future states of learning, where we use big data from many students. And so what's the ethic component behind that? And so that's also kind of a collaborative setting, as you might understand. And so is it ethical to use data from others to predict my possible learning outcome? So that's also something I could bring in here. And that also needs to be decided based on the student's own opt-in possibility. So is a student really willing to opt in and share her data as well in order to make the system perform better? Or is the student saying, no, I'm not opting in because of that reason. I do not want to provide my data to make the system more intelligent in order to predict also for others. You see, there's kind of all these questions coming up. And if there's no transparency around the systems, then of course the decision would be really clearly. But yeah, the collaborative aspect is surely again the conversation we need to have and the openness we need to have in the conversation is the driver. So for all of these concerns being linked to collaborative learning as well.
So I think about that from the perspective of technological development. So when you have a team of people who are developing, right, these systems that rely on AI or that are going to provide AI for universities or for other people, that helping, and students can often be involved on those technological development projects, particularly when we start talking about at the graduate level. And so one of the things that I think about often, and not just for students, but also for other faculty, for people who are, engaged not only in the teaching and learning, but the development of the tools that we use for teaching and learning, collaborating around these and having these conversations around these ethical issues. Are we bringing enough perspectives to the table to start to design tools that are going to be much more inclusive, but then that are also starting from a place of ethics and not from a place of getting as much as you can to use? Also, it becomes complicated when you have these being developed at universities and then moving on to commercial purposes. And so how do you continue to, one, have the right people there to talk about the ethical components of it, but two, have those ethical considerations continue throughout the life of the project as it moves on to various iterations and is developed further, and you're connecting with larger groups of people related to the development of this technology. I think that there's a lot more to be discussed in that area as well, because we aren't, I don't think, doing enough to talk about that.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Jason from the audience. Jason, you can unmute yourself. Jason, going once, going twice. All right, we will take another question. Let me add it to the chat. The question is, how do you see the bridging of privacy and ethics for a more trusted learning analytics design and application?
So at the point where an institution is thinking about adopting a technology, so back to some of the things that we shared earlier, that those components of privacy and trust can be discussed right at that moment, and in fact should be discussed at those moments. That building up a habit of saying that when we adopt technology, automatically, just like we're asking people how much it costs, we're asking people what it does, we should also be asking about those ethical implications, the privacy implications, the trust implications. And then upon engagement with the community, with the stakeholders who will be engaging with this technology, that upon engaging with them, that's how you're going to learn about the different elements of trust. So that's how you're going to learn about these different elements of concern for them that, again, people may not have thought about. We have very different ideas about what should be shared publicly and what should be kept private, how we want to engage with technology, what information we want to share, what information we don't want to share. And so creating a space where that can be included in these conversations at the outset is absolutely important. And again, for things that are already underway, it is not terribly difficult to pull together a quick survey to get a sense for what's happening with people related to their trust of the devices and the technology that are already being implemented on various campuses. So I think the attitude of engagement and this attitude of seeing privacy and trust as really important components, that's the part that has to shift. That has to become a more natural part of what we're talking about and what we're discussing, so that it moves to the way that we practice and integrate and implement these technologies.
question that's actually, I think it's going to be for you, Dirk. Is an ethics officer a new academic leadership position? If not new, in what office does this position typically reside? It seems just as important as the information security officer.
Yeah, I truly agree. This is a very important position as institutions are moving forward with data analytics and AI and learning analytics systems. We need these ethics officers. And yes, it's a new leadership position in that sense. But what is most important here is as well that this is not a person coming in, and playing the ethics officer. First of all, this person needs to have this education data literacy really embraced and really demonstrating well. So that's important, and you don't find this, of course, in many institutions. So this role really has to be created, and on the other side also. This role needs to be respected within the organization. So whenever you bring, so that's the organization psychology perspective. When you bring into new roles into the leadership, this role has to be equally set up in the leadership hierarchy, of course, at some stage. So it shouldn't be, a person being below the information security officer, for example. So there needs to be the same levels of responsibility, the same institutional hierarchy level, I would call it. So that's important. So that is not a person just sitting somewhere in an office and maybe there might be some requests. It's the person driving the whole ethics and privacy in the institution, bringing all the stakeholders on the table and let them talk and exchange their ideas and their concerns. That's a very big task an ethics officer has to follow up. And I think if institutions really want to go that way, they really need to understand that this role has an important impact for the institution and will change the learning culture in the organization, right? So that's something which you should also understand. But yeah, it's a very important position, and it should be included in from my personal perspective in all the organizations.
Dr. Blackmon, did you have anything you wanted to add to that question?
No, not with the ethics. I've heard of privacy officers too, so it's really interesting that this ethics officer position is coming up as well. And I think it would be interesting to see the connections between those two offices.
Great. So we had another question. The data needed for training the AI model should be representative of the population the AI system is going to provide services for. What can we do to provide such data for the AI models?
So we could also question, of course, the predictive models and say, do we need these predictive models? And because there's always idiosyncrasies of data. And so maybe a predictive model works well in one context, but doesn't work at all in a different context. I published a study ways back in 2014 where we analyzed over 1 million student enrolled into higher education institutions and used the same algorithm to predict pass and fail rates, for example. And we found significant differences through different universities, but also through different areas of study. So the algorithm might work in one case and doesn't work in the other case. So there's a big concern about all these predictive models and predictive systems because of the idiosyncrasies of data. And so you can have this algorithm maybe performing well in mathematics, but it doesn't work at all in humanities. Things like that are all open on the table and have to be discussed again within the institution. So and then there's two perspectives. So one is, I call it the data-driven perspective, which is this is all the data sitting here in our institution. Let's do some magic data analytics and find patterns. Do some algorithms using a support vector machine approach or decision tree, and finding these patterns and building our implications around the findings we found through a discovery approach. I'm rather on the other side. Again, what do we want to achieve with something like a data analytics approach? and what indicators do we need to achieve this goal. That's a data demand perspective. So not using all data we have available, but clearly defining towards the goal what data is needed from research we already know, from theories we already know in learning and teaching, and then saying, okay, these are the 5 key indicators we need for building this predictive model, and then starting collecting valid data out of these indicators. So it's a very different perspective than using big data and analytics and having all this data which are meaningless. One example from my research also, we had a predictive model, again, looking into pass-fail rates of students. And one big driver was the payment methods of the tuitions of the student, which was an indicator being significantly contributing towards the pass and fail rate prediction. And in the first sense, it makes no sense, this indicator, but in the second sense, of course, it has implications from social demographic background, et cetera. So it has some implications, but these indicators can be very vague and of course misleading the implementation and the implications of data analytics. So I would rather say we need a data demand perspective, defining our goal, what we want to achieve, and then defining the indicators we want to address.
And I would say that we also want to trouble the origins of a lot of the data being used to make these sorts of determinations about student learning, right? That so back to the earlier point, and Dirk, it made me think of something that I read a couple of years ago related to the use of AI and at-risk students. So who is at risk? How are we making a determination that they are at risk? Do they know they are at risk? And when we tell them they are at risk, is that actually causing some form of harm, right? So I think there has to be more troubling than we currently do of all of these indicators and the origins of these indicators before we can even get to a place of saying, okay, now that we know this about our population, let's feed it into this system. So whether or not we feed it into the system or not is a huge question. But I think that the question before that question is, are we really sure that the data we're getting is accurate data? Are we sure that students have had an opportunity to speak back to those narratives about them? Because once we take, you take data that's untroubled and put it into a system, and then you get more troubling results. So I think asking those questions too, what is the source of this information, and how much agency have people had in being able to engage with these automatic assumptions that we're making about them?
Well, thank you to everyone who attended. We are out of time. We could probably have turned this into a 6-hour discussion. Thank you for all the great questions. Special thank you to the panelists, Dr. Blackmon, Dr. Ifenthaler. Again, I feel like between the different conversations, different questions, it's like 16 different papers have emerged and things that we could look at. So again, thank you for everyone who attended. My understanding is that we did record the session. It will be available through the Whova app probably in the next couple of days. But again, thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon or morning, depending on where you are in the world.
Thanks, everybody. See ya.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.